I never gave credit to ghost stories. I always sought logic, simple answers, until my daughter's 7th anniversary, Sophia. Between bright and noisy gifts, a box caught the eye. Torn brown paper, skipped cord without sender. I asked the guests, but no one knew anything. When Sophia opened her, a porcelain doll emerged, curly black hair, grimy white dress, and vitreous blue eyes that seemed to follow us. My wife found her peculiar. Sophia hugged her, calling her Clara, and took her to her shelf. That night, I slept without suspecting that the nightmare was already lurking us from the shadows. The first night passed without incidents. On the second night, I woke up startled at 3:35 in the morning. I had the strange feeling of hearing something. I rubbed my eyes, attributing the sudden awakening to the stress of the work. I walked down the hall to the kitchen to drink water when I noticed a crack of light under the door of Sophia's room. Strange. I'm absolutely sure that I turned off all the lights before bed. I pushed gently the door and saw that Sophia slept deeply, but the small lamp of the study table was lit, projecting a weak light that focused directly on the shelf where the clear doll was sitting. I approached to turn off the light and had the disturbing impression that the doll had slightly changed position. Her face now seemed to be turned straight to Sophia's bed when I'm sure she was profile when I put her there. I shook my head, blaming the sleep for the confusion, turned off the light and went back to bed. As I closed my eyes again, I couldn't ward off the uncomfortable feeling that something watched us from the shadows. On the third night, I fell asleep with difficulty. It had spent all day with a sense of discomfort that could not explain. At 3:30 in the morning, I woke up with my heart in my throat. The silence weighed, but a new sound cut the house. An insistent tick, like a watch we didn't have. Then came the laugh, children, soft, echoing from Sophia's room. It wasn't my daughter's laugh. I knew that sound well. This was different, more acute, with an ethereal quality that made the hair on my neck shiver instantly. I looked at the digital clock, 3:33. I got up in a jump without waking my wife, who was sleeping deeply. I walked down the dark corridor, guided only by the weak night light we kept plugged. The sound ceased as I approached Sophia's door. I took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in my hands, slowly opened the door. The vision I had froze my blood. Sophia slept quietly, but Clara, the doll, was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting at the foot of the bed, as if she observed my daughter to sleep. At that moment, my rational mind desperately tried to find an explanation. Maybe Sophia had woken up at night, picked up the doll and sleeping back? But then where did that laugh from? And why was the doll perfectly sitting, as if it had been carefully positioned? I entered silently in the room, took Clara and examined her under the weak light. Her vitreous eyes looked more alive than she remembered, almost humid, and her previously neutral painted smile now seemed slightly malicious. I put it back on the shelf, this time facing the wall. I straightened Sophia's blanket, kissed her forehead and went back to the bedroom, where I spent the rest of the night in course, listening to every ranger of the house and questioning my own sanity. The next morning, during the coffee, Sophia was quiet, stirring the cereal. I asked if she had played with Clara at night. "No," he replied, the lost look. "But I dreamed of a girl with black hair. She sang something sad and drew it. She showed me a roll. A scribble of two girls, one with a doll, and the number 333 in the corner. While Sophia was at school, I decided to investigate the doll. He said nothing to my wife, she would laugh at my paranoia. I examined Clara closely and, under black hair, found an almost erased inscription. Elizabeth R. 1976. A name, a date, a thread of mystery. I searched old newspapers online and soon found a 7-year-old girl, Elizabeth Reiner, missing from the room in 1976. The photo showed a curly hair with a doll just like Clara. Laughs in silence, empty bed, open window, and the doll disappeared as a spectrum. My blood froze. The clock marked a few hours for 3:33. That night, I suggested that Sophia slept with us, speaking of a supposed leakage on the ceiling. I took the doll to the basement and locked it in a box, stacking weights on top. My wife, frowning, followed me there. "What's going on?" he asked firmly. I told everything, the laughter, the doll moving, Elizabeth. She was silent, then took my hand. "It's not just stress. I also heard something yesterday," he admitted, the distant gaze. "Let's protect it together." We put Sophia to sleep between us, and I watched the digital watch slowly. 3:30, 3:31, 3:32. When the clock marked 3:33, the sound of children's footsteps echoed through the hall, followed by a crystal laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at the same time. My wife sat suddenly on the bed, the wide eyes of horror. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Before he could respond, the door of our room began to open slowly, ranging on the hinges. We freeze on the bed, hugging Sophia that was still sleeping deeply. The door finished opening completely, revealing the empty and dark corridor. Then we saw small wet footprints appeared in the bedroom carpet, forming one after another, as if an invisible child walked toward us. The air around the footprints seemed distorted, like hot waves. My wife choked a scream, squeezing Sophia against her chest. The footprints stopped at the feet of our bed and, for an endless moment, only silence filled the room. Then the mattress sank lightly on the tip, as if someone had climbed into bed. "I want my doll back," he whispered, a childish voice, so close that I felt the cold breath on my face. It was not a threatening but deeply sad voice, carried a loneliness that transcended decades. I felt involuntary tears run down my face as my wife trembled uncontrollably beside me. The next morning, we took the doll to the historical museum without saying a word. The curator, an elderly woman with a penetrating look, paled to see her. He guided us to a room full of old cutouts and murmured, "You are not the first." Photos of families with Clara came up at the table, all marked by dark stories. One from 1993 linked her to the thrift store where he was bought days ago. "Elizabeth disappeared with her," said the curator, a low voice. "They say she still tries to go home, through the doll." We returned home in absolute silence, the doll wrapped in a white cloth in the back seat of the car. Sophia was at school, which gave us a few hours to decide what to do. The curator had given us two options: return the doll to the place where Elizabeth disappeared, hoping that it could help her spirit find peace, or destroy her completely, although she warned us that this last option could arouse something worse. Sitting at the kitchen table, we looked at the package as if it were a bomb about to explode. It was my wife who finally broke the silence. "We can't just get rid of it and send the problem to another family," I agreed. "It would be like condemning other children to the same terror." At that moment, the phone rang. It was Sophia's school. Our daughter had passed out during class and was calling Clara. When we arrived at the ward, Sophia was pale, with deep dark circles, as if she had not slept for days. Seeing the package in our hands, his eyes illuminated in a way that did not seem natural. "She wants to go home," Sophia murmured with a strangely adult voice. "She just wants to go home." That night we made our decision. We found that the house where Elizabeth had lived still existed, although abandoned for years around the city. We put Sophia in bed early, doped with a slight cough syrup to ensure that she slept deeply. We didn't want her to have any contact with what we planned to do. We wait until midnight and drive to the address indicated by the curator. The house was exactly as in ancient photos, a decrepit Victorian construction with broken windows and partially collapsed roof. The vegetation had taken over the garden, making the way to the almost impenetrable front door. We used lanterns to illuminate the way as we loaded the doll still wrapped in the white cloth. The interior of the house smelled the mold and decomposition. We carefully climbed the ranging ladder to the second floor, where, according to newspaper clippings, was Elizabeth's room. The bedroom door was strangely intact, as if time had not affected it in the same way as the rest of the house. When we opened it, the cold air hit us like a physical wave. The room was surprisingly preserved, like a 70s capsule of the 70s. Flowered wallpaper peeled from the walls. A small canopy bed remained covered by a dusty comforter, and a shelf with faded children's books occupied a corner. But what made me choke was the shelf above the bed, just like Sophia's room, and empty, as if waiting for something, or someone. I put clearly carefully on the shelf, removing the cloth. In the oppressive silence, the ticker of an old wall clock echoed like a hammer. 3:30. My wife grabbed my arm tightly as the temperature dropped even more, our breath forming clouds of condensation before our faces. 3:31. A creak sounded behind us. The cabinet door opened slowly, revealing only darkness inside. 3:32. The wind began to circulate in the room, although all the windows were closed, raising dust and small pieces of paper. 3:33. It was then that we heard the same children's laugh, but now closer, more corporeal. The room's mirrors foggy instantly, and, in the center of the room, a form began to materialize, first translucent, then increasingly solid. A girl with black, curly hair wearing a white-stained white dress. She didn't look at us, her eyes fixed only in the doll. "Clara," he whispered, extending his pale and thin hands. The doll on the shelf began to vibrate and, for an impossible moment, his glass eyes blinked. So something even scarier happened. The doll's painted mouth moved. "Elizabeth," he replied with a voice that seemed to come from his own walls. The floor under our feet trembled and cracks began to graduate from the center of the room to the ends. The ghostly girl took the doll and hugged her against her chest. Her eyes finally turned to us. "Thank you," he said softly. "Now we can go home." What happened next will remain forever recorded in my memory, a nightmare that revisits every night. The floor between us and Elizabeth opened like a hungry mouth, revealing not the lower rooms of the house, but an infinite darkness dotted by small lights like distant stars. A wild wind began to suck everything to that abyss: curtains, books, toys. Elizabeth remained immobile, hugging the doll, smiling serenely as her feet levitated a few inches from the floor. I grabbed my wife and pressed ourselves against the wall, fighting the force that pulled everything to the emptiness. "She won't stop," I shouted above the wind roar. "She wants to take something with her." In that moment of pure terror, my wife ripped her covenant and threw her into the abyss. "Take it, a symbol of our love for our daughter," he shouted desperately. For a moment, everything stopped. Elizabeth looked at the flooded ring and then her smile softening. She took the ring, put it on the doll's finger, and on a last look that froze my blood, said, "She's waiting for you at home." When we recover consciousness, we were lying on the lawn in front of the house. The sun was born on the horizon, bathing the ruins in a golden light that made them look almost benign. There was no sign of the opening on the floor, doll or Elizabeth. We ran to Sophia's room, empty, the untouched bed. A cold cut the air as the lights flashed. On the shelf, my wife's covenant shone, untouched by the abyss. Beside, a wax chalk design. Two girls holding hands, Sophia and Elizabeth, smiling with Clara between them. In the corner, in my daughter's shaking letter, 3:33, time to go home. Then a distant echo, Sophia's laugh, mixed with tic-tac, from nowhere.